this seems preposterous to me. I think that how the imagination got such a hold on us was that we accepted into our diet catalysts that we were unaware of, that pushed our mental state around, specifically psychedelics of various sorts. And a reasonable working definition of psychedelics, what they do, whether you're for it or against it, whether you think it triggers paranoia or ataraxia, they are catalysts for the imagination. They catalyze thought. Thought becomes more baroque. It reaches deeper into reality for data. It sees forms of connectivity that previously escaped it. It makes leaps of assumption, not always correct, but sometimes correct. So what it does is by, to some degree, transferring chaos into the mental world, it creates a much richer dynamic. And so thought processes become more complicated. And in a sense, then, language becomes the behavior which expresses the imagination. It can be expressed in a limited form through dance, through gesture, and of course it can be expressed very well through painting if you've reached the stage where you have painting and are not chipping rock or drawing in blood in the sand or something like that. But if you have really a rich technology behind your artistic intent, but that rich technology would never have arisen without the intercession of language. And so these two things, which make us unique among nature's productions on this planet, imagination and language, seem to be almost like the exterior and interior manifestation of the same thing, the same phenomenon. And what it is it's a facility with data, an ability to connect it in novel ways for one's own entertainment and amusement, if nothing else. Storytelling is obviously this kind of activity where modules, a ghost, a princess, a lost kingdom, a disturbed father-son relationship, these modules are manipulated to entertain people. And it's a cliche that there are only 5 stories. And I think Robert Graves in The White Goddess argued there's only one story. And we keep telling variants of this story over and over again. Well, what history then is, or what culture is the phenomenon that attends the rise and spread of the imagination in the human species. But because the imagination works on this what-if model, it always tends toward idealism. In other words, it is not simply a networked process. It's a networked process with a vector field. In other words, it's going somewhere. It's not just a random walk. It's headed somewhere. We idealize. If you're going to play the game what if, most people who are psychologically healthy don't sit around entertaining dire possibilities. What if I get a terrible disease? What if I'm run over by a truck? No, people say, what if I make a lot of money? What if I meet somebody who gives me a lot of money? And it begins to tend toward idealism. And we are obviously ruled by ideas and ideas. We haven't found a good one yet, but we certainly have sacrificed a lot of blood and time in the process of discovering a whole bunch of bad ideas. And we haven't lost our faith in ideas, even though human history is the record. Not one idea has survived from the distant past in its original form. And some of the most persistent ideas, I would argue, are some of the most pernicious ideas. I mean, the idea of man's inherent flaw, that's an old idea, and how much suffering has existed because of it. But culture, then, is the record of the human imagination. Well, that's fine. That is of interest to anthropologists and somebody else who knows. What gives the whole thing a lot of bite is that more and more the imagination is where we spend our time. There's a lot of talk these days about virtual reality, an immersive, state-of-the-art technology in which you put on goggles and special clothing or enter special environments, and then you are in artificial worlds created by computers, and this is thought to be very woo-woo and far out. But in fact, if you're paying attention, we've been living inside virtual realities for about 10,000 years. I mean, what is a city but a complete denial of nature? And say, no, not trees, mud holes, waterfalls, and all that. Straight lines, laid out roads, class hierarchies reflected in local geography, meaning the rich people live here, surrounded by the not-so-rich people, all served by the poor people, who are so glad they're not the outcast people. Urbanization is essentially the first of these impulses where society leaves nature and enters into its own private Idaho. And the growth of cities and the growth of the immediacy, I guess you would say, of the urban experience has been a constant of human evolution since urbanization began. Now, the only difference that the new technologies offer is we are going to do this with light, not mortar, brick, steel, aluminum, and titanium, which are incredibly intractable materials. I mean, it's amazing to me. We started with the toughest stuff, and of course, it cost enormous amounts of human blood and treasure to work with such intractable materials. It's always been amazing to me that the largest buildings human beings ever built are, in a sense, the first buildings human beings ever built, because the pyramids of Egypt are enormous, even by modern scale, and yet they were among the earliest buildings ever built. In virtual reality, the difference between a 100-story building and a 10-story building is 1 0. That's all. In a line of code, you specify 100 over 10, and you get a 100-story building instead of a 10-story building. What this should tell us is that in the domain of light, the intractability of matter is overcome. And so we are on the brink of a time, we have arrived, we are at the time where the human imagination now need meet no barriers to its intent. And so we are going to find out who we are. We are going to discover what it means to be human when there is no resistance to human will. Now, this is, I suppose, like a litmus test for paranoia. Is this going to be a nightmare of, 24-hour-a-day sadomasochistic pornography? Or is it going to be, will we literally build heaven on earth? Knowing what I know about the human animal, I suspect it'll be both and. Because we're not going to get everybody marching in the same direction on this. And one person's hell is another person's heaven. The world is becoming more and more defined by the imagination. And those of us who are involved in creating this, I think, have the feeling that it has a kind of built-in dynamic toward finality. In other words, this is not a process that can go on for hundreds of thousands or even hundreds of years, because the human imagination is so endlessly self-transcending. Whatever its most advanced creation of the moment is, it's in the process of obviating and denying it and seeking to go beyond it. And, I think it was Plato, I'm not sure he said it first, but said, if God does not exist, human beings will create God. Well, I think the truth is they're not even going to wait to find out. It's easier to cut to the technical solution and sort the whole thing out later. And if the God we make and the God we find are in conflict with each other, they'll just have to duke it out. Maybe they'll Marduk it out, I'm not sure. That art's task is to save the soul of mankind, and that anything less is a dithering while Rome burns. If the artist cannot find the way, then the way cannot be found.